She gave me the last food she had, the woman in the silver crown said, and the entire town square fell silent. Sophie Bennet stood at the edge of the crowd with flour still caught beneath her fingernails, her worn brown coat pulled tight against the bitter morning wind. For one impossible second, she did not recognize the woman speaking. The traveler from the night before had worn a threadbare gray cloak, boots split at the seams, and a scarf pulled low over tired eyes. Now she stood beneath the royal banner in a velvet coat the color of midnight, a moonstone crown resting over her pale silver hair. Beside her stood King Ethan Calloway, tall and still in a black winter coat, his dark hair brushed back from a face too serious for the sunlight touching the snow. His silver-gray eyes were fixed on Sophie as though she had said something important without realizing it. Around them, the people of Briar Hollow shifted uneasily. The same neighbors who had passed Sophie on the street without looking at her now stared openly. Gavin Reed stood near the raised platform in his polished navy coat, one gloved hand clenched around a stack of official papers. His confident smile had vanished. Sophie could not understand why. She had only given a hungry stranger a loaf of bread. Queen Mother Evelyn Calloway descended the platform steps slowly, stopping a few feet from Sophie. In her hand was the old silver button she had left behind, its half-moon design catching the pale light. "You had one loaf," Evelyn said softly. "You were cold. You were hungry. Yet you gave it to me." Sophie's throat tightened. She could still see the previous evening as clearly as if it had not ended. Snow had drifted in thin sheets along the narrow street outside her family bakery. The lamps were burning low. Her feet ached from standing behind the counter since dawn, and all she wanted was to carry the last warm loaf home to her grandmother. But the woman by the stone wall had looked so tired. Not dramatic. Not demanding. Just tired in the quiet way Sophie knew too well. "I did not know who you were," Sophie managed. Evelyn's eyes softened. "That is why I will never forget." A murmur moved through the crowd. Gavin's face tightened, but Sophie barely noticed. Her attention had fallen to Ethan. The Alpha King had not spoken once. He looked at her with a strange expression, not pity and not royal approval. It felt more like recognition. As if he had spent years searching through crowded rooms for someone who could see a need without being told to look. Sophie lowered her gaze, suddenly aware of her faded dress and the empty basket hanging from her arm. "Your Majesty," she said to Evelyn, "I only did what anyone should have done." "No," the Queen Mother replied. "You did what too few people remember to do when no one is watching." Ethan stepped forward then, his boots quiet against the snow-dusted stone. The air seemed to change around him, not with fear, but with the weight of every person waiting to hear what he would say. Sophie's heart beat hard enough to hurt. Gavin lifted the papers in his hand. "Your Majesties," he began quickly, "there has been a misunderstanding concerning Miss Bennet and her unpaid obligations." Ethan did not look at him. His eyes stayed on Sophie. "There will be time for every truth to be heard," he said. Then he turned toward the crowd, his voice calm and clear. "But first, I want to know why a town with royal food shipments has an Omega giving away her last meal in the snow." The answer began the night before, when Briar Hollow had been buried beneath a slow, colorless snowfall and Sophie Bennet stood alone behind the counter of her parents' bakery, counting the coins in the old cash drawer for the third time. There were $7.40, 2 buttons, and a receipt for flour she could not afford to replace. The little shop smelled of cinnamon, yeast, and the faint smoke from the wood stove that never seemed to warm the back room enough. Outside, the street lamps cast weak gold circles across the frozen sidewalks. Most of the town had already gone home, carrying whatever food they had managed to buy before the market stalls closed. Sophie watched a man hurry past with a sack of potatoes over one shoulder, his scarf wrapped high over his face. She watched a mother pull 2 sleepy children through the snow, their boots leaving shallow tracks that vanished almost as quickly as they appeared. Then she looked down at the last loaf on the cooling rack. It was small, no bigger than her forearm, with a dark golden crust and a soft center still warm from the oven. She had saved it for her grandmother. Eleanor had spent the whole afternoon insisting she was not hungry, which usually meant she had been hungry since breakfast. Sophie knew the way her grandmother's hands trembled when she tried to pour tea. She knew how carefully she stretched each meal so Sophie would not notice there was less on her own plate. Sophie wrapped the loaf in a clean linen cloth and tucked it into her basket. The bell above the door rang before she could reach for her coat. Gavin Reed stepped inside with snow melting on the shoulders of his expensive navy overcoat. He smelled of cedarwood, polished leather, and the kind of comfort Sophie had never been able to trust. "Closing early again?" he asked, though the clock behind the counter clearly showed it was nearly 9. Sophie kept her hands flat against the wood. "We close at 9. Gavin glanced toward the empty shelves. "A difficult season for business. A difficult season for everyone." His smile was thin. "Not everyone manages their accounts poorly." Sophie's chest tightened, but she did not answer. Gavin had been repeating the same warning for weeks. Rent had increased. Delivery fees had increased. Emergency grain permits had increased. Every bill came with his signature at the bottom, and every time Sophie asked why the town's food prices kept rising while royal supply wagons were supposed to be arriving, Gavin found a new reason. Road delays. Storm damage. Inventory errors. Always something. Never proof. He leaned one elbow on the counter and lowered his voice. "You have until Saturday morning to settle the balance." Sophie glanced at the basket beside her boot. "I told you I need more time. Time is expensive." He let his eyes drift toward the wrapped loaf. "So is flour." Sophie moved before he could reach for it, pulling the basket closer. Gavin's smile disappeared for half a second. "Still saving scraps for that old woman upstairs?" he asked. "My grandmother has a name. Then perhaps she should use it to ask someone richer for help." The words landed quietly, but Sophie felt them all the way to her ribs. Gavin straightened his cuffs, satisfied with the silence he had created. "Saturday," he repeated. "After that, the bakery becomes inventory." When he left, the bell above the door gave one cheerful ring that felt almost cruel. Sophie stood still until the sound of his footsteps faded into the snow. Then she put on her coat, lifted the basket, and locked the door behind her. She did not yet know that before she reached home, the last loaf of bread in her hands would become the reason a queen remembered her name. Sophie walked home through streets that had grown quieter with every falling flake. The basket bumped lightly against her knee, and the wrapped loaf inside filled the air around her with the warm smell of fresh bread. It should have comforted her. Instead, it made her think of Saturday morning, of Gavin's smooth voice, and of the empty shelves behind the bakery counter. Briar Hollow had once been a place where people left pies cooling in open windows and neighbors traded jars of jam for bundles of firewood. Now, every porch light seemed dimmer. Every door stayed shut a little longer. The town had been waiting for royal food shipments for nearly a month, but the wagons that arrived at the eastern depot never seemed to reach the market. Gavin called it a delay. He called it bad weather. He called it a temporary inconvenience. Sophie called it hunger. Her home stood above the bakery, a narrow brick building with peeling blue shutters and a crooked chimney that leaned slightly toward the street. The kitchen window glowed when she reached the steps. That light was the only thing that made her shoulders loosen. Inside, the apartment smelled faintly of peppermint tea and old wood. Her grandmother sat at the small table by the stove, wrapped in a faded green cardigan, sorting dried chamomile into glass jars. Eleanor looked up when Sophie entered, and her smile came too quickly. "There you are," she said. "I was beginning to think the snow had swallowed you." Sophie set the basket on the table and removed her coat. "The snow is not that ambitious." Eleanor laughed softly, then coughed into her hand. Sophie noticed the cup of tea beside her grandmother was full. The plate in front of her was empty. "Did you eat?" Sophie asked. "Of course." Eleanor began reaching for another jar. "I had soup earlier." Sophie looked at the pot on the stove. It was clean. Not empty. Clean. Her grandmother had washed it so carefully that even the smell of soup was gone. Sophie did not say anything at first. She unwrapped the loaf and placed it between them. Steam curled from the broken edge. Eleanor's eyes softened at once, but she shook her head. "That is for you. We can share it. You worked all day. So did you." Eleanor's hands paused over the chamomile. For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was the wind brushing snow against the window. Then Eleanor looked down at the loaf. "When your mother was your age," she said quietly, "she used to say that a warm meal could make a person feel like the world had not forgotten them." Sophie swallowed. Her mother had been gone for 7 years, but some nights her memory still seemed to sit in the empty chair beside the stove. "The world has not forgotten us," Sophie said, though the words felt thin. Eleanor looked at her with the kind of tenderness that made pretending difficult. "No," she said. "But some people have." Sophie broke the loaf in half and slid the larger piece toward her grandmother. "Gavin came by tonight." Eleanor's face changed. Not much. Just enough for Sophie to see the fear she had been trying to hide. "What did he say?" "Saturday." Eleanor closed her eyes. "Sophie, maybe we should consider his offer." The room went still. "His offer is not help," Sophie said. "He wants the bakery. He says he can keep it running. For himself." Eleanor reached across the table and covered Sophie's hand with her thin, weathered fingers. "I do not want you carrying all of this alone." Sophie looked at their hands, then at the snow gathering against the glass. She wanted to tell her grandmother that she was scared too. She wanted to admit that every new bill made her feel smaller, that every empty shelf in town felt like a warning. But she only squeezed Eleanor's hand and said, "We will get through the week." A knock sounded downstairs. Not at the apartment door. At the bakery door beneath them. Sophie and Eleanor both looked toward the floorboards. It was nearly 10 o'clock. No customer came for bread at 10 o'clock during a snowstorm. Sophie rose slowly, pulling her coat back on. "Stay here," she said. Eleanor caught her sleeve. "Sophie." Her grandmother's voice was barely louder than the fire. "Do not let anyone make you believe that being kind means being easy to take from." Sophie held her gaze for one long moment. Then she nodded, picked up the basket, and stepped back into the cold. The bakery below was dark except for the pale glow spilling from the kitchen window. Sophie moved carefully down the narrow staircase, one hand trailing along the worn banister, while the other held the basket close against her side. The building creaked around her in the cold. Every sound seemed louder after 10 o'clock. The wind pressing against the shutters, the soft ticking of the wall clock, the faint scrape of tree branches along the roof. At the bottom of the stairs, she paused behind the bakery door. "We are closed," she called, trying to keep her voice steady. For a moment, there was only the snowstorm. Then a woman answered from the other side. "I know, dear. I am sorry to trouble you." The voice was low and gentle, but it carried a tiredness that made Sophie's hand tighten around the latch. "I only wondered if you knew where I could find a warm place to sit for a few minutes." Sophie looked through the small glass pane beside the door. A woman stood beneath the awning, half hidden by a gray cloak dusted with snow. She appeared older than Sophie's grandmother, though she held herself with a strange quiet dignity. Her boots were cracked and wet. Her gloved hands trembled at her sides. There was no cart behind her, no travel bag, no family waiting at the curb. Just the woman, the storm, and the empty street. Sophie unlocked the door. Cold air rushed into the bakery, carrying the sharp scent of snow and distant chimney smoke. "You can come in for a moment," she said. The woman stepped over the threshold slowly, looking around at the bare shelves and flour-dusted counter. Her eyes paused on the little brass bell above the door, then on the warm basket Sophie still held against her hip. "You should not waste heat on strangers," the woman said softly. Sophie closed the door behind her. "Heat is not much use when someone is freezing outside." The woman looked at her for a long moment. Her eyes were clear and gray, much too observant for someone who claimed only to need a place to rest. "And your family?" she asked. Do they not need the heat too? Sophie glanced toward the ceiling, toward the apartment where Eleanor waited beside the stove. They do, she admitted. But we have a roof. That matters. The woman's gaze lowered, and something in her expression changed. Not pity. Something quieter. Something almost painful. Sophie led her toward the small table near the bakery stove, where the last coals still glowed beneath a layer of ash. Sit down, she said. I can make tea. You have no tea leaves left on those shelves, the woman observed. Sophie gave a small smile. My grandmother has peppermint upstairs. She would scold me if I did not offer it. The woman sat, but Sophie noticed the way her eyes drifted toward the basket. The smell of the bread had warmed the room as soon as Sophie had brought it downstairs. Her stomach tightened. She had planned to split it with Eleanor. She could already picture her grandmother's thin hands breaking off the larger half and pretending she was full after 2 bites. The stranger noticed Sophie looking at the basket and quickly looked away. Please do not worry about food, she said. I only needed to get out of the snow. But her voice had gone softer. And Sophie knew that softness. It was the voice people used when hunger had become too familiar to admit. Outside, the wind rose and rattled the front window. Sophie looked at the bread in her basket, then at the woman's worn boots, then toward the ceiling where her grandmother waited. Her fingers closed around the linen cloth. The loaf was warm. It was small. It was all she had. And somehow, in that quiet bakery with the storm pressing close, Sophie understood that the hardest choices were not always the loudest ones. Sophie stood beside the table with the basket pressed against her coat, listening to the wind drag itself across the dark storefront. The stranger had lowered her eyes, perhaps to spare Sophie from the choice sitting so plainly between them. That made it worse. If the woman had begged, if she had reached for the bread, if she had acted entitled to it, Sophie might have found it easier to protect what little was hers. But she only sat near the dying stove with her hands folded in her lap, trying to look as though the cold had not settled into her bones. Sophie thought of Eleanor upstairs. She thought of Saturday morning and Gavin's threat. She thought of the empty shelves, the unpaid flour bill, the small warm loaf that could carry 2 people through a hard night if they broke it carefully enough. Her fingers trembled beneath the linen cloth. Then she lifted the bread from the basket and placed it on the table in front of the stranger. Please, she said. The woman looked at it but did not touch it. This is yours. It was, Sophie replied. Now it is yours. And what will you eat? The question was quiet, almost stern. Sophie tried to smile. My grandmother makes peppermint tea strong enough to convince your stomach it has had dinner. For a second, the woman said nothing. Her gray eyes shone in the dim light from the stove. Then she reached for the loaf, but Sophie noticed how carefully she did it, as though accepting kindness required more courage than refusing it. The woman broke off a small piece first. Steam rose from the soft center, carrying the warm scent of flour and salt through the bakery. She closed her eyes as she tasted it. Sophie looked away, pretending to straighten the jars near the counter, because something about that single bite made her chest ache. The stranger ate slowly, never taking more than a little at a time. She did not rush. She did not waste a crumb. When she finally looked up, her face had softened, and the lines around her mouth seemed less heavy. Why did you give me all of it? She asked. Sophie rested both hands on the counter. Outside, the snow kept falling, quiet and relentless. Because hunger should never have to prove it deserves kindness, she said. The words surprised her as soon as they left her mouth. They sounded like something her mother might have said. The stranger held Sophie's gaze for a long moment, and in that silence, she seemed less like a tired traveler and more like someone carrying a secret too large for the little bakery to contain. At last, she reached beneath her cloak and removed a small silver button from the inside pocket. It was old, worn smooth at the edges, with a half-moon carved into its center. She set it in Sophie's palm and closed Sophie's fingers around it. Keep this, she said. Not as payment. Never as payment. Sophie glanced down at the button. It felt heavier than it looked. I cannot take this. You can't, the woman said. And someday, when people try to make you feel small for having a gentle heart, remember that kindness is not weakness. It is a kind of courage most people never learn. Before Sophie could ask her name, the woman rose from the chair. Sophie reached for her old wool scarf and wrapped it around the stranger's shoulders despite the woman's quiet protest. The gray cloak hid most of it, but Sophie tucked the ends firmly beneath the woman's chin. At least keep this until you find somewhere warm, she said. The stranger touched the scarf with one gloved hand. Her expression changed again, and this time Sophie thought she saw grief there, or gratitude too deep to name. Then the woman stepped back into the snow. She paused beneath the awning and turned once toward the bakery window. You will be remembered, Sophie Bennet, she said. Sophie froze. She had never given her name. But before she could speak, the traveler disappeared into the white darkness, leaving only a trail of footprints and a silver moon resting in Sophie's hand. Sophie remained by the bakery window long after the traveler's footprints vanished beneath the falling snow. The silver button lay in her palm, cold at first, then slowly warming against her skin. It was not valuable in the way Gavin Reed measured value. There were no jewels set into it, no royal stamp obvious enough to make a banker lean closer. Yet the half-moon carved into its center caught the weak light from the stove and seemed to hold it. Sophie turned the button over once, twice, searching for a clue. There was nothing on the back except a thin line of tiny lettering worn almost smooth by time. She could not make out the words. Upstairs, the floorboards creaked. Eleanor was probably waiting by the table, listening for Sophie's return. Sophie tucked the button into her coat pocket, locked the bakery door, and climbed the narrow stairs with the empty basket hanging from her arm. The apartment felt warmer than before, though that might have been because she had come in from the snow. Eleanor sat exactly where Sophie had left her, one hand curled around the untouched cup of tea. Her eyes moved immediately to the basket. Where is the bread? Sophie took off her coat slowly. I gave it away. For a moment, Eleanor did not speak. Sophie braced herself for concern, for the soft sadness that always made her feel worse than anger ever could. Instead, her grandmother looked toward the window, where snow feathered against the dark glass. Was someone hungry? She asked. Sophie nodded. Eleanor's face softened. Then it went where it was needed. Sophie sat across from her, exhausted enough that the chair felt like it might hold her forever. She knew my name, she said. I never told her, but before she left, she said I would be remembered. Eleanor's hands became still over the table. Sophie reached into her pocket and placed the silver button between them. The moment Eleanor saw it, all the color drained from her face. Her fingers hovered above the small piece of metal but did not touch it. Where did you get this? She whispered. Sophie felt the air in the room change. The woman gave it to me. Eleanor looked up sharply. What woman? Sophie told her everything. The snow-covered cloak. The cracked boots. The quiet way the traveler had looked at the bread. The scarf Sophie had wrapped around her shoulders. With every word, Eleanor seemed to grow more distant, as though she were listening to something from a life long ago. When Sophie finished, her grandmother finally picked up the button. Her thumb traced the half-moon with a tenderness that made Sophie's chest tighten. This symbol belongs to the Calloway family, Eleanor said. Sophie blinked. The royal family? Eleanor nodded slowly. Not just any member of it. The Queen Mother wears this mark on her private seal. Sophie stared at the button, then toward the staircase, as if the stranger might somehow still be standing below in the dark bakery. That cannot be right, she said. She looked like she had nowhere to go. Eleanor's eyes filled with a worry Sophie had never seen before. Sometimes people with the most power go where no one will recognize them, she said. Before Sophie could ask another question, a hard knock struck the bakery door downstairs. Once. Then again. The sound traveled through the quiet apartment like a warning. Sophie and Eleanor looked at each other. This time, either of them moved at first. Then a voice called up from below, smooth and certain through the floorboards. "Miss Bennet, this is Gavin Reed. I have brought the seizure notice." Sophie rose from the table before Eleanor could stop her. The silver button disappeared into her pocket, its small weight suddenly feeling larger than the whole bakery beneath them. Gavin Reed had not waited until Saturday. Of course he had not. Men like Gavin only believed in rules when the rules bent toward them. Eleanor pushed herself up from her chair, one hand gripping the edge of the table. "Sophie, let me speak to him." "No," Sophie said, more quickly than she intended. She softened her voice. "You stay warm. I will handle this." Her grandmother looked as though she wanted to argue, but the hard knock came again from below, followed by Gavin's patient voice. "Miss Bennet, delaying this will only make it more unpleasant." Sophie pulled on her coat without fastening all the buttons, then stepped down the narrow staircase into the dark bakery. The room smelled faintly of bread and cold ashes. She did not turn on the lamps. Instead, she stood behind the counter for one quiet second, letting her eyes adjust to the blue-gray light leaking through the front windows. Gavin waited outside beneath the awning, perfectly dry beneath a wide black umbrella. Two men stood several feet behind him beside a wooden cart. They wore plain work coats and avoided looking directly at the bakery windows. Sophie knew what the cart was for. Shelves. Baking tins. The old copper kettle her mother had used every Thanksgiving. Anything Gavin could call inventory. She unlocked the door but kept it closed behind her. "It is late," she said. Gavin smiled as though she had invited him to tea. "It is business." He held out a folded document stamped with a dark blue seal. "The town office has approved an emergency seizure due to your unpaid grain fees and commercial rent." Sophie did not take it. "The deadline was Saturday. The deadline changed after your account was reviewed." "By whom?" Gavin's smile barely shifted. "By the people responsible for keeping Briar Hollow stable." Snow gathered along the edge of his umbrella. Sophie looked past him toward the empty street. No neighbor stood nearby. No one opened a curtain. People in Briar Hollow had learned that trouble was safest when it belonged to somebody else. "You cannot take the bakery tonight," Sophie said. "My grandmother is upstairs." "Your grandmother may remain upstairs," Gavin replied. "For now. But the shop belongs to the district until the debt is resolved." His eyes drifted over her shoulder toward the dark interior. "Unless you are prepared to accept my earlier offer." Sophie felt the silver button press against her palm from inside her pocket. The Callaway symbol. The Queen Mother's private seal. Eleanor had sounded certain, but certainty did not stop Gavin from standing on their doorstep with a cart. "Your offer was never help," Sophie said. "It was a way to take what my family built." Gavin's expression cooled. "Your family built a failing bakery. I am offering you a future with fewer disappointments. A future where I have no say in anything." "You have a say now," he replied. "That is more than most people get." The words were meant to sound practical. They were meant to make her feel childish for wanting more. But Sophie remembered the stranger sitting beside the dying stove, accepting bread like it was something sacred. She remembered Eleanor's warning upstairs. "Do not let anyone make you believe that being kind means being easy to take from." Sophie stepped closer to the door, keeping the lock between them. "Come back with a proper order in the morning," she said. "And bring someone who can explain why royal food shipments never reached the families they were meant for." For the first time, Gavin's face changed. It was small. A tightening in his jaw. A flicker of caution behind his eyes. "You should be careful what questions you ask," he said. Sophie held his gaze. "You should be careful what you steal." The snow seemed to hush around them. Gavin folded the seizure notice with slow, deliberate hands. Then he tucked it back inside his coat. "Saturday morning," he said. "Do not mistake tonight for a victory." He turned away, and the two men followed him with the empty cart. Sophie watched until the storm swallowed them at the end of the street. Only then did she close the door and lock it. Her hand was shaking when she turned back toward the bakery. On the counter, beneath the dim reflection of the window, the silver button had slipped from her pocket. The half-moon symbol caught the light. And for just an instant, it seemed to glow. By morning, the snow had stopped, but Briar Hollow looked colder than it had the night before. A pale sun hung behind the clouds, turning every rooftop and fence rail the color of old silver. Sophie opened the bakery before dawn because she could not sleep. She swept flour from the counter, warmed the oven with the last of the firewood, and arranged 3 small rolls on a tray as if the shop were still capable of serving a normal morning. Upstairs, Eleanor rested beneath 2 quilts, her breathing thin but steady. Sophie had promised she would return before the first market bell. She had not promised that everything would be all right. Some promises were too fragile to say aloud. The silver button rested inside the pocket of her apron. Every few minutes, Sophie touched it without meaning to. In daylight, it looked ordinary again. Old metal. A half-moon worn smooth at the edges. Yet she could not forget the faint light that had moved across it after Gavin left. Nor could she forget the traveler's final words. "You will be remembered, Sophie Bennet." The bell above the bakery door rang just after 8. Sophie looked up, expecting a customer. Instead, Gavin Reed entered with Claire Dunning beside him. Claire wore a pale gray coat trimmed in white fur, her blonde hair tucked perfectly beneath a velvet hat. She glanced around the bakery with the same expression people used when inspecting something they had already decided was broken. Gavin did not remove his gloves. "Good morning, Miss Bennet," he said. "I hope you have reconsidered my offer." Sophie kept both hands on the counter. "No," Claire sighed dramatically. "Sophie, this does not need to become unpleasant." "Then do not make it unpleasant." Gavin's smile did not reach his eyes. "There is another matter. A royal item has been reported missing from the visiting supply inspection team." Sophie felt her pulse falter. Gavin watched her closely. "A silver button bearing the private half-moon crest of the Calloway family." The quiet inside the bakery deepened. Sophie could hear the oven crackle behind her. She could hear Eleanor moving faintly upstairs. "Why would you think I know anything about that?" she asked. Claire stepped forward, her expression arranged into concern. "Someone saw a cloaked stranger leave this bakery last night. Then this morning, a palace rider arrived asking whether anyone had seen a missing royal seal. It seems like a strange coincidence." Gavin leaned one hand against the counter. "Unless it is not a coincidence." Sophie looked at him and understood. He had not known about the button last night. But he knew now. Somehow, word had already reached him that the royal family was in town, and he had decided to turn the discovery into another weapon. "I did not steal anything," she said. "Then you will have no problem letting us search the premises." Sophie's jaw tightened. "You do not have authority to search my home." "Perhaps not," Gavin said. "But the royal inspectors will." He placed a sealed notice on the counter. "They are gathering in the town square at noon to address the missing shipment records. You may bring the item there and explain yourself, or I can report that you refuse to cooperate." Claire's smile was small and satisfied. "It would be a shame for your grandmother to see royal guards at her door." Sophie looked down at the sealed notice. Her hands wanted to shake. She folded them together instead. "I will be at the square," she said. Gavin studied her for one long second, as if he had expected her to panic. Then he tipped his head in mock courtesy. "Good. Do not be late." When they left, the bell above the door gave a soft, cheerful ring that felt wrong in the empty bakery. Sophie waited until their footsteps disappeared before reaching into her apron pocket. The silver button lay against her palm, cold and still. At noon, she would walk into the town square carrying the only proof that the stranger had been real. And somehow, she would have to decide whether that proof would save her family or give Gavin one more reason to take everything. At 11:45, Sophie Bennet locked the bakery door and stood beneath the faded blue awning with the silver button hidden inside her coat pocket. Across the street, the town square was already filling with people. They arrived in small groups through the lingering snow, shoulders hunched against the cold, faces drawn with the same cautious hopes Sophie had seen at her counter for weeks. Mothers held children close. Older men leaned on canes. Store owners stood near the fountain with their hands buried in their pockets, watching the raised platform where royal banners had been hung that morning. A black crescent moon shimmered against each banner, bright and unfamiliar above Briar Hollow's ordinary brick buildings. Sophie looked back once at the upstairs window. Eleanor stood behind the glass wrapped in her green cardigan, one hand pressed against the curtain. Sophie lifted her hand in return, though she could not tell whether the gesture was meant to reassure her grandmother or herself. Then she started walking. The snow beneath her boots had turned to gray slush along the curb. Each step carried her closer to the square and farther from the small, predictable fears she had known until now. Gavin's threats had been cruel, but they had been simple. He wanted the bakery. He wanted the land beneath it. This was different. The silver button felt cold against her ribs, and the question in her mind would not leave her alone. Why would the Queen Mother's private seal be in the hands of a traveler who had stood hungry in Sophie's bakery? At the edge of the crowd, Sophie saw Gavin Reed beside Claire Dunning. He wore the same navy coat as before, but today a dark blue armband marked him as the local distribution director. Claire stood close at his side, pale and polished, her eyes moving through the crowd until they found Sophie. Her mouth curved in a faint smile. Sophie did not return it. She found a place near the front, beside Mrs. Alvarez from the tailor shop and a young father named Daniel who had been buying half loaves of bread whenever Sophie had enough flour to bake. "Did they bring food?" Daniel asked no one in particular. His little boy held tightly to his sleeve, staring at the empty wagons lined along the far side of the square. There were 6 of them, all painted with the royal crest. Their wheels were muddy. Their canvas covers were tied down. Sophie watched Gavin glance toward them, then quickly away. The bells of the town hall rang noon. A hush spread through the square. First came 4 palace attendants in dark winter uniforms. Then 2 guards moved aside, and a black carriage rolled slowly through the archway at the north end of the street. It stopped before the platform. The carriage door opened. The woman Sophie had fed stepped down into the snow. There was no gray cloak now. No cracked boots. Queen Mother Evelyn Calloway wore midnight velvet trimmed with silver thread, her pale hair swept neatly beneath a moonstone crown. The crowd bowed at once. Sophie could not move. Evelyn's eyes found her immediately. Not by accident. Not after searching. As if she had known exactly where Sophie would be standing. King Ethan Calloway stepped from the carriage behind his mother. He was taller than Sophie had expected, dressed in a black coat that made the snow seem brighter around him. His face was calm, but his silver-gray eyes moved over the empty wagons with an attention that made Gavin's posture stiffen. A royal clerk began reading from a parchment, listing the dates, weights, and destinations of every food shipment sent to Briar Hollow. Sophie listened carefully. The numbers sounded impossible. Enough flour for every bakery in town. Enough dried beans for every family. Enough winter grain to keep no child hungry until spring. Yet the market shelves had been bare. The soup kitchens had closed early. Her grandmother had washed an empty pot so Sophie would not know she had skipped dinner. When the clerk finished, Ethan stepped to the front of the platform. "These records say Briar Hollow received everything it was promised," he said. His voice was not loud, but it reached every corner of the square. "I am here because the people standing before me tell a different story." Gavin cleared his throat. "Your Majesty, the weather caused unavoidable losses. The supply chain has been under pressure." Sophie felt the silver button against her heart. She thought of the old woman in the bakery, eating slowly so she would not seem desperate. She thought of Eleanor's warning. She thought of Gavin telling her to be careful what questions she asked. Before fear could close her throat, Sophie stepped out of the crowd. "That is not true," she said. The square went completely still. Sophie's voice did not rise, but it carried across the square with a clarity that surprised even her. Gavin turned toward her slowly, and the smile he had worn all morning disappeared. Claire's gloved hand tightened around the edge of her coat. For a heartbeat, Sophie wished she could step back into the crowd and become invisible again. She could already feel the eyes of Briar Hollow on her, the people who knew her only as the quiet Omega from the bakery, the girl who worked too late and apologized too often. But then she saw Daniel's little boy holding his father's sleeve. She saw Mrs. Alvarez's thin shoulders beneath her old wool coat. She thought of Eleanor washing an empty soup pot so Sophie would not worry. "The wagons came," Sophie said, looking at King Ethan because his face was the only one in the square that did not make her feel small. "I saw them arrive at the Eastern Depot." Everyone did. But the market never received the flour, the beans, or the grain that was listed on those records. Gavin stepped forward before Ethan could answer. "Miss Bennet is upset about her private debts. She has misunderstood normal distribution delays." Sophie turned toward him. "Then why did you charge my bakery emergency grain fees for shipments I never received?" A murmur passed through the crowd. Gavin's expression tightened. "Those charges were standard regional assessments." "They were not standard," Sophie said. Her hands trembled at her sides, but she kept talking. "Every invoice had a different delivery date. Every one was signed by you. And every time I asked where the flour had gone, you told me to stop asking questions." The square grew quiet again, but this silence felt different. It was not waiting for Sophie to fail. It was listening. Queen Mother Evelyn descended the platform steps, her velvet cloak brushing the snow-dusted stone. She stopped in front of Sophie, and for a second the world seemed to narrow to the woman's familiar gray eyes. Without the threadbare cloak and cracked boots, Evelyn looked every inch a queen. But Sophie could still see the traveler who had accepted warm bread with shaking hands. "Do you recognize this?" Evelyn asked. Sophie reached inside her coat and pulled out the silver button. A soft gasp moved through the crowd. Gavin's face went pale. The half-moon gleamed in Sophie's palm. Evelyn touched it with one gloved finger, her expression softening with something that looked almost like grief. "This is my private seal," she said. "I left it with a young woman who gave me the last food she had." The words struck the square like a bell. Sophie's breath caught. Around her, neighbors stared. Claire looked at Gavin, and for the first time, fear broke through her polished composure. Ethan stepped down beside his mother. Up close, he seemed less distant than he had from the carriage, though the calm in his silver-gray eyes made Sophie's pulse quicken. "My mother traveled through the border towns without royal escort because we received reports that the supply records did not match the hunger we were seeing," he said. "She found empty cupboards, closed kitchens, and families living on half meals while our ledgers claimed every shipment had arrived." Gavin swallowed. "Your Majesty, I had no knowledge of any deception." Evelyn looked toward the covered wagons lined along the square. "Then perhaps you can explain why the relief supplies were found this morning in a private warehouse under your distribution office." Gavin opened his mouth, but no words came. Ethan did not look at him. He looked at Sophie instead. "What do you want us to do?" he asked. Sophie stared at him. She had expected questions. She had expected suspicion. She had not expected anyone to ask what she wanted. The cold wind moved through the square, carrying the clean scent of snow. Sophie looked at the hungry families gathered around her, then at the bakery across the street, then at the Queen Mother who had remembered one loaf of bread. "Open the wagons," Sophie said. "Feed the town first." For a moment, no one moved. The request was so simple that it seemed to confuse the people who had spent weeks turning food into numbers, numbers into fees, and fees into reasons why ordinary families should wait. Then King Ethan looked toward the covered wagons at the edge of the square. "Open them," he said. His voice was calm, but the command carried farther than shouting ever could. Palace attendants stepped forward at once. They untied the canvas covers, and the cold air filled with the scent of grain, dried apples, flour, beans, and fresh winter vegetables packed in wooden crates. A sound rose from the crowd, not quite cheering at first. More like disbelief? Daniel covered his mouth with one hand while his little boy stared at the food as if it might disappear when he blinked. Mrs. Alvarez pressed her fingers to her lips, tears gathering in her eyes. Sophie stood very still, watching the crates come down from the wagons one by one. There was more than enough for the town. More than enough to fill the market shelves, reopen the soup kitchen, and keep every oven in Briar Hollow warm for weeks. Gavin had never been dealing with delays. He had been dealing with greed. Queen Mother Evelyn turned toward the royal clerk. "Record every item," she said. "Every crate. Every invoice. Every false fee collected from the people of this town." The clerk bowed and began directing a team toward the wagons. Gavin's jaw tightened. "Your Majesty, there may be an explanation for the warehouse records." Ethan finally looked at him. The Alpha King's expression did not change, but the square seemed to grow quieter around him. "Then you will have every opportunity to provide one through the proper inquiry," he said. "You will not provide it by speaking over the families you failed." Gavin glanced around the crowd, perhaps expecting someone to defend him. No one did. Claire stood beside him with her face turned pale beneath the gray sky. Sophie noticed that she kept looking toward the bakery, then toward the open wagons, as though she could not decide which loss frightened her more. An attendant approached Sophie with a basket full of flour, potatoes, beans, and a wrapped parcel of fresh bread. "For your household," he said. Sophie stared at it. Her first instinct was to shake her head. There were so many people behind her. So many hands waiting. But Queen Mother Evelyn stepped closer and touched Sophie's arm lightly. "Take it," she said. "You cannot keep feeding others by pretending you do not need care yourself." The words landed softly, but Sophie felt them all the way through. She accepted the basket. It was heavier than the empty one she had carried the night before, and for a second she had to look down because her eyes had filled too quickly. Ethan watched her without saying anything. He did not look triumphant. He did not look as though he had given her a favor. He looked as though he understood that accepting help could be as difficult as offering it. When Sophie lifted her gaze again, the food distribution had begun. Families formed orderly lines. Children clutched small bags of dried fruit. The old soup kitchen owner stood near the first crate of beans with both hands over his heart. The square, which had felt frozen and frightened only minutes earlier, slowly began to breathe again. Queen Mother Evelyn looked toward Sophie. "Your bakery will reopen with its shelves full," she said. "And Gavin Reed's seizure notice is no longer valid." Sophie blinked. "I do not know how to thank you." Evelyn's eyes warmed. "You already did. You gave a stranger the only meal you had." Then Ethan stepped closer, close enough that Sophie could see snow melting in the dark strands of his hair. "There is one more question," he said quietly. "When this town has been fed, what do you need to keep it from being forgotten again?" Sophie looked at the open wagons, at the people carrying food home, at the bakery window across the street where Eleanor waited behind the curtain. Her fingers closed around the basket handle. This time, when she spoke, she did not ask for rescue. "I need the truth written down," she said, "so no one can ever hide hunger behind a ledger again." By late afternoon, the town square no longer looked like a place built for fear. The wagons stood open beneath the pale winter sky, their empty canvas covers lifting gently in the cold breeze while families carried food toward their homes. Smoke began rising from chimneys along the street as stoves were lit again. Somewhere near the old soup kitchen, someone laughed for the first time in weeks, and the sound was so unexpected that Sophie turned toward it before she realized she was smiling too. She stood beside the bakery steps with the basket of food resting at her feet. Eleanor had come downstairs wrapped in her faded green cardigan, one hand resting lightly on Sophie's arm as though she still could not quite believe the square was full of flour and beans instead of worry. "You did this," Eleanor whispered. Sophie shook her head. "No. I only told the truth." Her grandmother looked toward the royal platform, where the palace clerk was writing carefully in a large ledger while Queen Mother Evelyn watched over his shoulder. "Sometimes that is the bravest thing a person can do," Eleanor said. Across the square, Gavin Reed stood near the town hall doors with two palace officials beside him. He was not being touched or dragged away. He simply looked smaller than he had the night before, stripped of the confidence that had once filled every room he entered. Claire stood a few feet behind him, staring at the snow beneath her boots. Sophie felt no joy in seeing them afraid. Only a tired kind of relief, like finally setting down a basket she had carried too far. King Ethan walked toward the bakery, his black coat dark against the white street. The crowd parted for him, though he did not seem to notice. His attention stayed on Sophie. She could feel her pulse begin to quicken, not from fear this time, but from the strange awareness that followed him like winter air. He stopped beside the basket and looked at the bags of flour, beans, and bread inside. "Your grandmother should have enough for several weeks," he said. Eleanor lifted her chin with quiet dignity. "That is generous, Your Majesty." Ethan bowed his head slightly. "It is overdue." Sophie watched him, uncertain what to say. He had listened when she spoke. He had asked what she needed instead of deciding for her. In a single day, he had made the town feel different. But she knew one royal visit could not fix every empty shelf or every person who believed hunger was someone else's problem. "You said you wanted the truth written down?" Ethan said. Sophie nodded. "Yes." He gestured toward the clerk and the open ledger. "Then help us write it." She blinked. "Me? You kept the invoices. You saw the prices change. You know which families were charged for food they never received." His silver-gray eyes held hers, steady and serious. "The court can investigate the numbers. But it will need someone from Briar Hollow to tell us what those numbers did to people." Sophie looked toward the bakery window, where old handwritten receipts were stacked in a wooden box beneath the counter. Her mother had taught her never to throw away a record, even when the paper was stained with flour or tea. Every bill, every delivery note, every missing shipment. She had kept them because she did not know what else to do. Now, for the first time, they might matter. "I can show you," Sophie said. Ethan's expression softened. "Then we will listen." Queen Mother Evelyn approached them, carrying the silver button between her gloved fingers. She placed it gently into Sophie's palm. "This belongs with you for now," she said. "A reminder that the smallest act can reveal the deepest truth." Sophie closed her fingers around it. The half-moon felt warm against her skin. As she looked from Evelyn to Ethan, a quiet certainty settled inside her. The bakery had not been saved by magic. Briar Hollow had not been fed because someone powerful took pity on them. It had begun because one hungry woman spoke, and another hungry woman was willing to listen. Then Ethan glanced toward the old bakery door and said, "When you are ready, Miss Bennet, I would like to see the place where my mother found the bravest person in this town." The bakery looked smaller with King Ethan Calloway standing inside it. Sophie noticed that first. His black winter coat seemed to bring the cold of the street in with him, though he paused at the door long enough to brush the snow from his shoulders and lower his head beneath the crooked little bell. It gave a soft chime above him, the same cheerful sound it had made every morning since Sophie was a child. Ethan looked up at it, then around the room. His gaze moved over the flour-dusted counter, the rows of glass jars, the old copper kettle near the stove, and the faded photograph of Sophie's parents hanging beside the shelves. Nothing in the bakery was grand. Nothing was polished. But for the first time in months, the shelves were not empty. Bags of flour rested near the back wall. Baskets of potatoes and beans stood beside the oven. Fresh bread, delivered from the open wagons, cooled on a clean cloth near the window. Eleanor sat at the small table with a cup of peppermint tea, watching Ethan with the calm patience of someone who had lived long enough to recognize the difference between power and character. "It is not much," Sophie said before she could stop herself. Ethan turned toward her. "It is a home," he replied. The simplicity of it made her throat tighten. Outside, Briar Hollow was beginning to change. She could hear the scrape of shovels clearing the sidewalk and the distant voices of neighbors carrying food from the square. Someone had lit the soup kitchen stove again. The smell of wood smoke and warm bread drifted through the cracks around the windows. Sophie set the old wooden box of receipts on the counter between them. "These are the records," she said. "My mother kept everything. I did too." Ethan opened the box carefully. He did not toss the papers aside or call for someone else to do the work. He lifted the first invoice, reading the flour-stained numbers in silence. Sophie watched the silver in his eyes move across the page. "You kept all of this through 3 winters?" he asked. "I thought someday someone might care." Ethan looked up. Someone should have cared sooner. For a moment, the words sat between them, too honest to answer easily. Queen Mother Evelyn stood near the window, the old gray scarf still folded over her arm. Sophie had not realized she had brought it inside until Evelyn touched the wool with gentle fingers. "You gave me this too," she said. "And you did not know who I was." Sophie smiled faintly. "You were cold. So were you." Evelyn's eyes softened. "That is what makes it matter." Ethan set the invoices down and stepped closer to the counter. He did not reach for Sophie. He only looked at the silver button resting in her palm. The half-moon was warm again, though the bakery itself was still cool near the front windows. "May I see it?" he asked. Sophie held it out. His fingertips brushed hers as he took it, and the small button gave off a quiet silver glow. Not bright enough to fill the room, but enough to make Eleanor sit a little straighter in her chair. Ethan went still. The air around him seemed to hush. Sophie felt something stir beneath her ribs, not fear exactly, but a strange familiar pull, like hearing a song from another room and knowing somehow it had been written for you. Ethan looked at the button, then at her. "That seal has never reacted to anyone outside my family," he said softly. Evelyn's expression changed, surprise giving way to something older and knowing. Sophie tried to laugh, but the sound caught in her throat. "Maybe it is just warm from my hand." Ethan's mouth curved in the smallest smile. "Maybe." But neither of them looked convinced. Outside, the late afternoon light turned the snow gold. Inside the bakery, surrounded by proof of every hardship Sophie had survived, she stood with the Alpha King and his mother as the silver half-moon glowed between them. Then a palace messenger appeared at the door, breathless from the cold, holding a sealed letter marked with the royal crest. "Your Majesty," he said, "there is an urgent report from the northern border." Ethan took the letter, and as he broke the seal, the warmth in his expression disappeared. Sophie watched his eyes move across the page. Then he looked at her, at the bakery, at the button still shining faintly in his hand. "Miss Bennet," he said quietly, "it seems your kindness was not the only thing my mother found in Briar Hollow."